Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my very toasty warm backyard in beautiful Los Angeles, California. It's 99 degrees here, so yeah, it's quite warm, but I'm excited to be with you today and to share with you a little bit about a very interesting, rare, and charismatic animal, the black-footed ferret. So this is Critter Chat number 48, black-footed ferrets. Black-footed ferrets are the only native ferret species to North America. There are two other ferret species in the world, one in Europe, one in Siberia. Of those, the domestic ferrets that people have as pets come from the European ferret. So those have been kept as pets or in houses with humans for several hundreds of years. And that's where domestic ferrets come from. Black-footed ferrets are quite distinctly different from those species. Ferrets are in the family of animals called mustelids, which is kind of a big and funny, weird word. Mustelids, the common theme throughout most of them as animals is that they have scent glands. And scent glands are special glands in their body that produce a very smelly, oily substance that allows them to help mark their territory, or sometimes they use it as a defense or a way to kind of claim territories from other animals. So other members of the mustelid family are going to be things like otters, badgers, wolverines, those kind of critters. Weasels, of course. Ferrets and weasels are pretty closely related, although ferrets are bigger than their weasel cousins. Black-footed ferrets also are sometimes called BFF, black-footed ferret. BFF's a fun acronym that can mean several other things. I'm not a huge fan of acronyms usually, but BFF is one that is pretty important to me. So, black-footed ferrets, BFFs. They once ranged across the Great Plains of the United States and a little bit into Canada and a little bit into Mexico. So they kind of lived in the grasslands, in the prairie areas. And they at one point numbered tens of thousands of individual ferrets out there. Now they're pretty small animals. Black-footed ferrets range in length from about 19 to 24 inches long, and that includes a 5 or 6 inch tail. They're pretty low to the ground, pretty sleek animals, and they only weigh about 1.5 to 2.5 pounds. So they're pretty small, pretty lightweight little critters. They all have the same color pattern, so you're not going to find a lot of differences in how they look. They all pretty much look the same color-wise. So they kind of have this light colored body that's kind of beige or cream color across the belly and on the front half of their body, and then on their back it's just slightly darker. It's more of a tan. And then they have black markings on their feet, on their face, and on the tip of their tail. And so that's why they are called black-footed ferrets. They all have black little feet. They're very cute. If you didn't see the photo I posted earlier on Instagram or Facebook, make sure you check that out because they are very interesting and cute little animals. Now they are also, despite the fact that they are cute, they are highly specialized carnivores. That means they eat other animals, and the other animals that black-footed ferrets eat are prairie dogs. Prairie dogs are 90% of their diet out in the wild. So they are a very specialized predator that goes after one kind of food source. They live in prairie dog towns, in the burrows that prairie dogs live and make. Black-footed ferrets live right around the prairie dogs, so it's not like they have to come in to go hunting. They already live there. If you wonder how that works, prairie dogs build amazing underground tunnels that are called prairie dog towns. And some prairie dog towns can be tens of thousands of individuals in one big community with many interlocking tunnels and separate tunnel systems for different family groups that kind of make up this whole big community. So a black-footed ferret might move into a specific little tunnel system, and then the prairie dogs would move out. Now, prairie dogs also share their towns with a lot of other animal species. So in prairie dog burrows, you may find burrowing owls. You may find different kinds of snakes. You might find different kinds of bugs. Occasionally, you will find a bigger mustelid called a badger. So prairie dogs are kind of used to having a lot of other animals around them. So although a ferret is a big predator of them, they kind of understand that, like, this is a community, it's an ecosystem, there's going to be other things around. So lots of things live in prairie dog burrows. The ferret just happens to also eat the animals who build their homes. Now that's also a little bit interesting. I mentioned that black-footed ferrets only weigh between 1.5 to 2.5 pounds. A big adult prairie dog can weigh 3 or 4 pounds. So they are hunting animals that are bigger than them weight-wise. If you think that that's really strange, if you compare other predators, things like lions sometimes go after things like zebras and buffalo that are more than double their size in weight as well. So it is somewhat common that predators sometimes go after things bigger than they are. Now, with prairie dogs being 90% of the black-footed ferret diet, anything that happens to prairie dogs affects the ferrets. They're so specialized in eating the prairie dogs that if problems happen with prairie dogs, those problems affect the ferrets pretty quick. Ferrets will occasionally eat other things like mice, ground squirrels, sometimes some birds, some little lizards or snakes, and some insects. But of all those other things, those are only like 10% of their diet. 90% is still prairie dog. Because prairie dogs are bigger than the ferrets, they typically only need to eat a prairie dog every like 3 or 4 days, unless it's a mom with babies. During the time that she's raising babies, she needs to be killing a prairie dog every day to feed her growing family. So black-footed ferrets also have a pretty short lifespan. That's kind of typical of small animals, small mammals in particular. Out in the wild, they probably only live 4 years. Some live a little longer. There have been some documented longer. In a captive setting, they sometimes live to be like 8, maybe 9, but still pretty short lifespans. Now, I mentioned that they once numbered in the tens of thousands. So if you think of the United States and the Great Plains, that's kind of everything between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. And they lived kind of in all of those states, wherever the habitat was right for prairie dogs. And as people kind of moved across the United States, and as the United States became more commercialized, and those states became highly developed for growing crops or raising things like cows, farmers and ranchers really tried to get rid of prairie dogs. And they used some pretty brutal and lethal methods to doing that, including some poisonings. They would sometimes dynamite prairie dog towns. They would sometimes just plow over them and try to get rid of the prairie dogs. They said it made it too difficult to grow crops or to raise cows in those areas. There is probably some truth to that. It would be hard to be growing corn if you're having a little rodent that lives there, the prairie dogs, that may also try to eat the corn or eat it when it's growing as little plants. There is some truth to that. However, the United States government subsidized farmers in getting rid of prairie dogs. They were viewed as a pest, and there was a huge campaign during the middle of the 1900s to get rid of prairie dogs entirely. And with that, they started to get rid of black-footed ferrets without even really realizing the implications that they were having. So because of that, black-footed ferrets were listed as a protected species in 1967, and they thought that there weren't very many of them left. In fact, twice they have thought that the black-footed ferret was extinct, and they had decided that it was gone entirely, extinct forever from everywhere, They didn't know of any more out there. None were in captivity. And then in 1981, a dog that belonged to a rancher, the dog's name is Shep. Shep was out wandering around the ranch where he lived, and he killed an animal and brought it back to the ranch house. And that animal was a black-footed ferret. And its owners, when they saw Shep had killed this animal, they decided that that animal was something special. And so they called the local authorities and they started to investigate. They found out it was a black-footed ferret. They knew it was a protected species. They also knew that they thought it had been extinct. So some scientists and researchers went out and started looking around this ranch. This ranch is located in Wyoming, near the little town called Meeteetse, Wyoming. And because of this dog and the dog's owners, they were able to find that a colony of prairie dogs existed that still had black-footed ferrets there. And they closely monitored this location for a number of years, and they realized that the black-footed ferrets were slowly decreasing in population there. And that was largely due to several different diseases that had been introduced into the area, including canine distemper and rabies. Prairie dogs can also get the plague, and that caused some of the prey areas of prairie dogs to die off as well. In 1986, the scientists who were monitoring this little colony of black-footed ferrets in Meeteetse, Wyoming, did kind of a survey to see how many ferrets they could find. They realized that the numbers were really low, and they decided to do something different. And so in 1986, they started to safely trap the black-footed ferrets that were there, and they brought them into a captive situation. They did that so that they could start a captive breeding program. They were only able to catch 18 ferrets. That's all they thought were there. And so they brought them in and started a breeding program that was managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services in cooperation with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, who had all this amazing experience of breeding animals in a captive setting. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and a group of zoos came together to form a cooperative effort to breed the black-footed ferrets. They worked together under the guidance of the Endangered Species Act, of which the ferret was legally protected underneath. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services actually built a breeding center, and they started with the 18 ferrets, and once they started to have some more babies, they shared those babies with a handful of other zoos. And so those include the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., the Louisville Zoo in Louisville, Kentucky, the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo in Colorado Springs, Colorado. At that time, the Omaha Henry Doorly Zoo. They later dropped out of the program for reasons I don't know. And the Toronto Zoo up in Canada, as well as the Phoenix Zoo in Phoenix, Arizona. And so those zoos all work together to coordinate breeding. And black-footed ferrets typically breed in the early spring. They then have like a 41 to 43 day gestation or pregnancy. Really short, just slightly longer than a month and a half. And then the mom can have anywhere from 1 to 6 babies. During that time, she raises the kits, as they're called. Baby ferrets are called kits. She raises them by herself. The dad is nowhere to be found. And she needs to hunt every day to bring them food. So when they're born, they're little tiny. They're about the size of a finger or a thumb. They grow pretty quick, and they're usually born in the spring in like March, April, maybe into May. And then by fall, by September, they're ready to live on their own as adults. Although they're usually not ready to breed till maybe that next year, so about a year old, maybe 2 years old. So they started to have these breeding centers in these different zoos, and they had very strict guidelines because they knew that the ferrets were susceptible to these diseases, and they had intended that they could someday reintroduce them to the wild, so they had to be very careful with the human interaction with the ferrets so that ferrets would still maintain some of their instincts. So over the years since that breeding program started in 1986, up until the latest data I could find, they have had 8,500 babies of black-footed ferrets born in those different breeding locations, which is really remarkable. That's a lot of babies. But even more remarkable is that they have kept extensive records of each of those babies. They can trace them back to those original 18 ferrets, and they have very extensive family trees that tie in all 8,500 babies. And they did a very controlled and calculated breeding program where they would find baby ferrets that were then growing up and ready to be the next year's breeders, and they paired them genetically with their best genetic matches. So in a captive situation, that is called a stud book. In human terms, that's like Ancestry.com, right? So they kept very good family trees, and it's kind of like online dating, like Tinder or something, where they match up people who are good matches. They were matching up ferrets who were good matches to have babies together. And over that period, they've had so many babies and they've had a lot of success. Now, in addition to that, they've also done some really cool science things with that. They've involved some very, very serious scientists, including geneticists and population planners and people who can study genetics, DNA, and artificial insemination. They've worked with different organizations who are able to freeze animal cells and keep them in a very safe and secure place called a frozen zoo. And they've been able to use cells from some of those original animals. They've been able to recently revive and use those cells again in an artificial insemination way, which has been really amazing and good for mixing up the genetic pool of all of these different ferrets that they've been captively managing. Now, because of that, in 2017, which is the latest data I could find, there are now in 2017, there were 280 ferrets living in captive breeding facilities in the United States. So even though they've had 8,000 babies, only 280 are left in zoos in the breeding program. That's because they don't live very long. Also, they have reintroduced them to 29 sites across 8 different states, and also into 2 sites in Canada and 2 sites in Mexico. So what I want to share with you about that is that zoos matter. Zoos make a difference, and zoos have been able to save this species under the guidance of the Endangered Species Act. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about my experience with them. As you know, on Critter Chat, I like to share my experiences, and my experiences with black-footed ferrets are pretty amazing and pretty unique. Today, my outfit is a little different than normal because I was part of the black-footed ferret species survival plan. When I worked at the Phoenix Zoo, I was an educator, and so I didn't directly take care of the ferrets. I didn't work specifically day-to-day with helping them raise ferrets to reintroduce to the wild. But I did a lot of education work and some public relations work to help bring more notice to the ferret program. And during my time there, we also closed our very old, archaic breeding facility and built a brand new one as part of the new conservation center at the Phoenix Zoo. And I helped speak at some of those events surrounding the opening of that breeding center, and also highlighting the accomplishments of the Phoenix Zoo's involvement in that, as well as the state of Arizona and the federal U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But even beyond that, I also attended species survival plan meetings where representatives from those 6 different zoos and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Breeding Center in Colorado came together to go over that stud book, the big family tree of all the ferrets, and help match up the different ferrets, to talk about the genetics, to talk about the efforts with artificial insemination, and bring those ferrets together to help further the cause in breeding the ferrets in a captive situation. But I've also been doing some other things. So I have gone twice to release sites as a volunteer with Arizona Game and Fish and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. I've gone to release sites in the state of Arizona where I have participated in black-footed ferret census. Now that's a pretty unique opportunity, and my experience is one of my most cherished experiences I've had in working with wild animals. The way that works is we go they do it twice a year in April and October. That's when the moms with babies are kind of out and about on hunting. And then in the October time frame, it's when the babies are dispersing from their nest where they were born and going out on their own. And with the census, it's pretty interesting. Our goal for the census is to count as many black-footed ferrets as we can in the release site areas where they've been reintroduced to the wild, and also do a general health analysis of any ferrets that we can catch or get our hands on, which takes it to a whole nother level. As I mentioned, they're very susceptible to diseases like rabies and canine distemper, and there are vaccines available to provide for those wild ferrets and help get rid of any of those problems. Also, they can get little ticks, little tiny bugs that are parasites on them, and they help remove those during those health checks as well. So this is a really cool opportunity that I was able to do twice. We would go up, it's in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. It's south of the Grand Canyon off of old Route 66, the highway that goes across the United States before the interstate system. And it's a big patch of land that's owned by a rancher who is happy to have prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets on his land, and he works closely with the government agencies overseeing the black-footed ferrets in that space. And so the way that you find a ferret out in the wild is you go out at night, because they are nocturnal. They can sometimes sleep 20 hours a day, and then they're awake for 4 hours at night hunting and getting their food, and then they go back underground and sleep some more. So they typically live in the prairie dog town in a burrow, and in the burrow where the ferret lives, there's not a prairie dog living in that burrow. The prairie dogs are a little smarter than that. So the prairie dogs are in the other burrows nearby. So the ferret has to come up out of the ground, run across the ground, and go into another burrow to look for prairie dogs for it to eat. So they pop up briefly, they're above ground, and then they go underground again. And so when we're doing the census, we're trying to find them in that time where they're above ground. And if it sounds like you're looking for a needle in a haystack, it kind of is. They're pretty small, but they have two really great things that help science out. One, they're very curious. So if they see something unusual, they kind of are curious to see what that is. And two, we talked about this a little bit with the jaguars. The jaguars in the photo I posted earlier when I did the critter chat on them had shiny eyes, right? Black-footed ferrets also have that. So that is called eye shine. It's common in a lot of predators. Your dog or cat at home has that. If you shine a flashlight in the dark on your dog or cat, you'll see shining back coming to you. And that's because they have something in their eye called a tapetum lucidum, which sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but that's a mirror that's part of their eye in the back of their eyeball that helps reflect light in their eyes and allows them to have really good vision at night. For black-footed ferrets, their eyes shine emerald green at night. And I mean emerald, like it is bright, bright, like something out of a cartoon. Bright green eyes at night. So we drive around in these trucks through this little like prairie dog town on these little dirt roads, and we're shining big flashlight spotlights around. And as we shine the big flashlights, we sometimes see these emerald green eyes staring back at us. And my first time going up and volunteering with the census, I was paired with a guy who had studied animals in college. He had just graduated. He was doing some field work, hoping to gain some experience to become a biologist. This was his third night being there. He had not yet seen a ferret. So I was pretty skeptical that we would be able to see a ferret. And I was hopeful, but trying to be realistic that it may not happen. So we started driving through our section of land. I'm shining a spotlight out one door. He's driving and shining a spotlight out the other side. And about 10 minutes into our drive, we see a ferret. And it's not far away. It's like 10 feet away, out my side of the door. Clearly the bright green emerald eyes. I shine the light a little more specifically and see the whole ferret out of the ground, standing right there. He runs and dives into a little burrow nearby. And so that's when we did our next steps. So we had big plastic cups, like Big Gulp cups from 7-Eleven, and we would plug all the holes to the burrows nearby. And then we would also set a little wireframe trap that would safely trap the ferret in one of the holes. And then we would cover that up with some burlap, so he wouldn't be able to see the trap really until he was in the trap. And then we would mark it with a GPS location tracker. And then we would drive around for a little bit and come back in an hour. So in an hour we came back, boom, we had a ferret in the trap. So we collect the trap, we safely close it up behind the ferret. It had already closed the door, but we closed a secondary door. And we took this trap, which was about this long, wrapped in the burlap, and got in the truck. And the guy I was partnered with, he was driving, so that means I held the trap. And so an hour and 20 minutes into starting my volunteer work, I was sitting in a truck with a trap on my lap with a ferret, with a ferret running across my lap. I had North America's most endangered mammal species literally sitting in my lap. And it was just an amazing experience to be able to be involved in something so special and something so rare. Most people have maybe heard of a black-footed ferret. They've rarely seen one. They're not very active during the day, so they're not on exhibit in a lot of zoos. And here I was with one sitting in my lap. We took it back to the little trailer where the scientists were working. They put the ferret under some anesthesia. They gave it a quick health check. They took off any ticks on it. They also scanned it, and our ferret did not have a tag in it. You can get these for your dog or cat at home that help identify which individual it is. It's called a PIT tag, a personal identification tag. It's a little tiny microchip that they inject into the animal. So they do that with all the ferrets too, so that if they catch that ferret again, they can track which ferret that is. So they said that our ferret was 2 years old, had been born in the wild since it didn't have a tag. This was the first time it had been caught. It only had a couple of little ticks. They vaccinated it for rabies and canine distemper. It was a little male ferret, not quite 2 years old, which was exciting. And then they gave it the reverse antidote to wake it back up. We kept it in the trap, and we also took with us a little sandwich bag, like a Ziploc bag, with a little piece of prairie dog meat in it, so that when we put the ferret back in its same burrow, we would give it some meat as its little reward of being part of science and being part of this experiment. They also took weights and measures to make sure that it was doing healthy and looked healthy. So they gave it like a 20-minute physical exam while we had it. During that night, we caught 3 other ferrets. So I had 4 ferrets under my belt on the first night of being there. 3 total. 3 total ferrets that first night, which was really amazing, especially since other people had been multiple times and never even seen one. I felt really, really lucky to be a part of such amazing field work and science in a conservation area. One of the highlights of my life to be involved with something like that. I further used that experience in my education position at the zoo in helping prepare a lot of the events and recognition of all the work that the Ferret Species Survival Plan has been doing. for years, and I was able to help celebrate a milestone anniversary for the zoo's involvement in that, as well as the program in general. That was really an amazing time for me at the Phoenix Zoo all those years ago. Our special shout out today is to the National Black-Footed Ferret Conservation Center. They have a link on Facebook. They have a profile there. I'll be sharing some information from them, as well as some videos of black-footed ferrets. If you think they're cute from the picture, wait until you see a video of one. They're amazing, they're adorable, and they're ferocious little carnivores. So it's really amazing to be able to see that and share that. In addition to zoos mattering and making a big difference, I want to talk a little bit about the Endangered Species Act. So this is an act that was signed into law in 1973 by President Richard Nixon. It was one of the great things that President Nixon ever did. So that law has been on the books for almost 50 years. It has helped save many endangered species, including manatees in Florida, the bald eagle. It's put in place a lot of regulations that have helped a lot of different animals. It has also helped protect and guide the recovery plan for the black-footed ferret. The current federal administration is trying to dismantle the Endangered Species Act. They are doing so to help out wealthy people who are looking to further develop industrialization, commercialization, and digging for more oil, natural gas, coal, and other things that actually hurt our environment and cause a lot of problems with climate change that we've talked about multiple times here, as well as some people who are wealthy business owners or landowners who don't like government telling them what they can and can't do if there's an endangered species that lives nearby. Specifically, the current administration is trying to change the way the Endangered Species Act is interpreted to limit the amount of climate change impact on any endangered species, and also to add a economic commercial value that gets added in when they are assessing if a species should be endangered or not. If it's costing industry a lot of money, the federal government administration currently thinks that we should not protect that species because it costs too much money for somebody who's trying to drill for oil and make more gasoline. So I would like you to think about that very carefully, as this is an election year, and support politicians up and down the ballot who help protect wildlife and who help protect wild places. It is because of these important laws that were signed into place many years ago and protected and honored by both parties for many years that we have so many of these species that have become threatened and endangered, and that we've been able to help recover. With that, black-footed ferrets are still listed as endangered. Their major threats today are the same threats that they've faced for the last 60 years, which are disease, loss of habitat, and loss of prey. Those are the problems that have been caused by eradicating prairie dogs and introduction of things like rabies and canine distemper out into their habitat. There are people who are still working towards protecting black-footed ferrets, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. I mentioned briefly that the data I found only went up to 2017, and that is because there is also current administration is trying to put what is called a gag rule on scientists to talk about things like this. They don't want people to share success stories, and they don't want to share data of how things have either been harmed in recent developments or protected and helped out by things like the Endangered Species Act. That's why the data is no longer available for the last 3 years, because the federal administration has put a gag rule on the scientists and conservationists working on these projects. They don't want that information shared. So it's an interesting time we're living in, with a lot of things on a lot of different fronts, but please keep that in mind as we move closer to the election in November. And think about it not only with politicians that are running in your local areas, whether that's mayor, city council, congressmen, senators, governors, mayors, but also the president and any of the higher ups that can control things, as well as any ballot initiatives that protect or loosen protections on local land, local water, local air, any of those environmental factors. Keep those in mind. I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared with you today. I know I've gotten political, I know I've gotten emotional, and for that, I don't apologize. I care about these things. They matter to me. I've spent my life working towards making things a better planet for the animals that we share our home with, and I don't apologize for being emotional or talking about political things when it impacts things I care about. I hope you've enjoyed what I've shared, and take care of yourself, be happy, have fun. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.